All right. Welcome to The Future Belongs to Creators, episode 16, I believe, where I am your co-host, also along with Barrett Brooks. Welcome, Barrett. How you doing?
Hello. I'm good.
Let's see. Quick thing, right off the top, we are actually on iTunes and Spotify now. So we'll drop some links in the show notes. I sent out an email to my list. If you're coming here from my email list, I appreciate you. But yeah, you can actually go subscribe. There's 10 episodes up there now. You can download all of those, binge those if you haven't listened already. And yeah, we're official as a podcast.
Well, I mean, that feels good. It took some
does.
time, but we delivered eventually. It wasn't as fast maybe as we would have liked, but now you can download to your heart's delight. You don't have to tune in every day, although we love the daily interaction. It's a ton of fun.
That's right.
Nice, Brad from the Pin Addict. Okay. Shall we start with how are you
Let's
doing?
do it. So I'd say I'm green today. Today was just a good day all around. We have a couple new designers that joined the team at ConvertKit, and we had a design stand up this morning, or a design meeting of like diving into everyone's designs and feedback. And it was just really fun to have that with a larger team. And then I also got to meet Caitlin, who's our latest team member on the finance side. And she's pretty great. So it's a good way to kick off the day. How about you?
Absolutely. I'm yellow today. Not the world, though. I would say actually work related, where it's in businessy terms, it's a new quarter.
Yeah.
And we're just kind of trying to dial in our transition from quarter to quarter. And right now, I'd say we're still not great at it. And that's just kind of got me a little flustered this morning.
Yeah, I think it's that, like, all the craziness in life and work, and then still trying to make things run consistently and deliver good results for customers and maintain systems and all of that. And yeah, those it takes practice, and some of those things are colliding right now in not the best way.
The one thing I will say this morning is that I was thinking about, so if I set all of those things aside and I think, all right, well, fine, that is what it is, and there's not a lot I can do about it immediately. I'm really grateful for the podcast, this one and the other one that we've started kind of behind the scenes, and then my writing, because it's like I have control over those creative endeavors. I can put effort in and get output out, which nicely transitions into our topic of the day, which is leverage, especially around different types of leverage, but using your name, signing your work with your name, metaphorically, and using creativity as a way to gain leverage, in addition to some other ways that we want to talk about. So you want to introduce this topic and why it came to mind for you and why you think it's going to be useful?
Yeah, so let's just dive right in, because I think we could spend a ton of time on this.
Great.
So leverage is, well, this came up listening to the podcast episode that I had as a resource yesterday from Naval. And you can find that nav.al/rich. The episode is titled How to Get Rich. And none of them are concepts that were particularly new to me. They were just explained very succinctly and very eloquently. So the idea of leverage, this kind of kicks off with now I'm spacing on the Archimedes quote. What is it? Give me a lever long enough and a place to
stand, and I will move the world. Yeah.
Yeah. And so basically leverage is when you have a disconnect between your inputs and your outputs. So typically if I'm doing hourly work of some kind, let's say I am digging a ditch in my backyard, which I actually need to do to run electrical for my tiny house. If anyone wants to come over and help, but you can't. But if I were to do that, then like I have no leverage in doing that task. It's going to take a certain amount of time. Whereas on completely the other end of the spectrum, say running a software company, I have incredible leverage, and we'll get into why that is. And so one of them can deliver wealth. The other one really can't, because it doesn't have leverage. And so today we want to break down a lot of, what leverage specifically is. And it's getting, inputs, being able to have outsized outputs and results, and then the different types, and specifically how, as a creator, leverage can play into your business.
Yeah, I love that. If I'm looking down a little bit in this episode, I've got my iPad here with some notes on it, um, because this podcast episode that, well, really, it's like a combination of a bunch of different places all the information came from. It kind of started from a tweet storm, tweet thread, and so I took a bunch of notes because it's a 3.5 hour podcast episode, which means you could really wind through a bunch of stuff. But before he gets into talking about different types of leverage, he talks about the willingness to embrace accountability.
Mhm.
And specifically, he talks about the willingness to do work under your own name. And I found this to be maybe the most important context we could set for this conversation, because as a creator, you are inherently embracing this reality that, and sometimes I think we try and hide from this, which is maybe a lesson to be learned, but you are inherently embracing the responsibility and the accountability that comes with attaching your work to your name. And it's the greatest honors of it, because now you can be recognized for the quality of your work. And it's the greatest risk, because if you failure being relative, and we can get into that a little bit, now your name has been attached to that failure, and you have accountability for that, and you're known for that. But that's in exchange for that downside, you get all of this infinite upside, because now you've taken this leap that allows you to gain a lot of value back in return from all of this.
So that touches on the idea of reputation as leverage. So there's tons of things that can be leverage, but you talked about reputation as leverage. And so for me, like, I think of reputation as something pretty important to me. And so if I come into a conversation and I have a good reputation, then the leverage that I have is I don't have to spend any time convincing you that I'm a reliable, trustworthy, smart, capable individual, because you already know that. And you have that from my reputation. You know, in the same way, if we talk about relationships as leverage, then you and I have a ton of leverage in this relationship, because we trust each other. We've worked together for years. We've known each other for 8 years now, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to executing on something, um, a new vision strategy for the company, getting anything done, even this podcast, right? We don't have to put nearly as much time into it because of that relationship that we have. And that turns into leverage.
That's right. That's right. And it's hard to build. One of the things that they talk about in this episode earlier on is the reality that when you skip from topic to topic or industry to industry, and you can no longer rely on the same relationships, you lose a lot of that. And I had this experience this week, actually. So I've got this personal project, a podcast I want to do that I hope will kind of fuel. So I'm doing some research right now on kind of what meaningful work looks like practically, like on the ground. And part of what I want to do is layer on top a storytelling layer. And I want to do that through a podcast where I interview people, specifically people working on what I consider to be some of the most important problems in society. And so I've got this National Geographic photographer that I've wanted to interview for this show, who has a foundation where he protects ecosystems and all of this, but he's also out there on assignment all the time. I figured, well, he's on quarantine. Maybe right now will be a good time to try and catch him. And so I sent him an email 2 weeks ago. Yesterday, I followed up and I got the dreaded assistant can response. Paul doesn't have time to take part in every project that you write him about, and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, what I'm lacking, because a lot of what I'm trying to do is like justify, this is going to be a valuable conversation for you. I can expose your work to a lot of people who don't know about it today, but he doesn't know that. I could just be some huckster off the street,
Right.
And he has no way to filter because there's no reputational signal there. And so I get a canned response. And so that's why having your name out there and having the reputation gives you all of this value you can build on over time.
Yeah. Yep. That makes a ton of sense. So Naval defines 3 types of leverage as like broad categories, and there's a lot more within it, but these 3 that he defines are labor, capital, and then we'll say products or distribution. And he says products with no marginal cost of replication. So we'll dive into each one of those. The first one, as far as that everyone's familiar with, is labor, right? So if I'm working on a task myself, I'm digging that ditch. My inputs exactly match my outputs. There's no leverage there. Now, if I get better tools, either a better shovel or a backhoe or something like that, I can start to have leverage. And then I could charge more for my labor. Um, but if I just get more people digging, more people building the house, whatever it is that we're doing, I have leverage when it comes to labor. And that's like the oldest form of leverage probably that there ever is. It's always been around. I was going to say it always will be around, but I actually don't believe that. And we could get into that more later. The second one is capital. And so capital is where you're able to use money to have it work for you. Have you ever heard the phrase, it takes money to make money? This is what they're referring to. I also don't completely agree with that phrase, but that's a topic for another episode. And so if we think about investors, so whether it's venture capitalists or someone like Warren Buffett or bankers or anything like that, they're using capital as leverage. So they're investing, they're getting a compounding return on it. And as Naval talks about in his episode, that's really like the leverage of the last century. That's how a lot of people got really rich, was off of capital. And both labor and capital, uh, while we shouldn't necessarily fault them, they tend to be like, that's the old way of leverage. And we tend to think poorly of them because they can tend to either exploit people, right? We're not the biggest fans of Walmart. And part of the reason is because they're all in on labor as leverage. And you're like, okay, but that's not creating wealth for a broad number of people. That has a lot of minimum wage or close to it jobs. And we look at capital and we're not thrilled with that as a form of leverage because it tends to be passed down generationally. You talk about old money, you talk about, billionaires are not the most popular people on the planet right now. And a lot of it is because we tend to resent capital as a form of leverage. So as you get into this final form of leverage, that's where I think creators can really shine. And this is, as Naval says, products with no marginal cost of replication. And so you could put it both product and media in this category. And so product would be, for example, I could sit down and I could teach you how to do a task, or I could write a book and sell it to you. And for every copy of this ebook that's sold, I have no additional work, right? There's a complete disconnect between the inputs and the outputs. I could spend 100 hours, writing this book, and then it could be read 10 times or it could be read a million times, has no extra input on the time it took to write. And then the other side of it would be media. So for example, as we create this podcast, for each additional person that watches it, there's no more work for us. We have infinite leverage. So there's tons of examples of that, but the most famous YouTubers, so if you look at Casey Neistat, for example, he has fantastic media leverage. His product is these YouTube videos that he puts out, and they have infinite leverage. There's no additional cost to distribute each one. So those are kind of the three main levers. And as creators, we want to focus on the third one.
Yeah, and I think one of the points that he makes, well, first of all, I love the historical context he added, that this all kind of started with the printing press, basically creating the early leverage for you to be able to spread thought beyond just your ability to show up and speak. But he talks about the value also of combining them, that there's a multiplier effect. And so you can start without labor or other than your own, and without capital other than your own, and create media or product leverage from day one, especially in digital products. And that's why we love this space so much, is that if you come at it with the right mindset, and I think one of the things Naval is really careful to say is that monopolists and people who take advantage of others are not who we're talking about here. And there's the form of that online too. There's the scammers and the spammers and the people selling a dream that's not actually possible to attain. And we try and run away from them as fast as we can. But for everyone else, there's this legitimate opportunity to get started, and to get started with relatively low capital cost, either in the form of labor or money. But as you grow, you can gain more and more leverage from having people help you and support that work, or having more money to apply to that work. And so that goes, like, if we were thinking back to our promotion episode, for example. So the whole promotion episode was, you are creating media of some kind. And on my dog walk this morning, actually, I was thinking about the fact that even if you're a musician, or even if you create furniture for a living, and that's your creative outlet, that's your original work, you still need to choose writing, video, or audio as a way to promote the product that you're making. It is media that drives attention and audience building, and an audience is who buys your stuff. And so every person, regardless of the creative outlet, must have a platform that they're going to use as well to build the audience for that creative output that they're making. Um, and so as you put it out there, you gain this audience, which becomes its own lever, and capital can influence that because you can accelerate it even faster. We have more capital now as a company, so we can spend money on advertising that accelerates the media we create much faster. We just put out a video story on Facebook the other day and promoted it with ad spend, and it's got like 4 million views. Now that's not 100% views, but it's some kind of viewer. 4
Right.
million different people have watched that thing. And that wouldn't happen if we couldn't multiply our media efforts with capital as well.
So as we break it down, because you touched on something really important, um, as a form of leverage, when we think about this as a creator, there's really two categories that I want you to think in. One is, how can I productize what I'm doing? Because that's going to create leverage. And then how can I build an audience? Because that creates leverage. So if we go back to kind of maybe the most basic example, and let's choose, I'm going to choose a designer and a musician, and we can kind of riff on some of these examples as we go. But first, with the designer, if I have no leverage, it would be that I'm doing hourly work for projects. So like um, I have my first graphic design internship. I'm making $20 an hour for, I don't know, I didn't have this internship, but it would have been for like the college newspaper or something like that, right? Like that role has no leverage. As I start to build reputation, it can get leverage in other ways. But then if I go to being a freelancer and I switch to project-based work, where I'm saying I will build that website for $1,000 or $2,000, now, good or bad, there's a disconnect between how much time I put in and the amount that I get paid for it. So there's a possibility for leverage there in going from hourly to project-based. And then as we take that further along, if I want to go from project-based to products, that's where we get no marginal cost. Then I can write that first ebook, or I can put together that course, or I could sell a WordPress theme or something else. And now all of a sudden, I have true leverage where there's a disconnect between, I can make something once, and no matter how many people buy it, I have no marginal cost of replication, and I can sell as many of those as possible. And then when you add that third element on it of an audience, and it's really another dimension of leverage that's combined with the product, then I can start to promote it to as many people as possible. And that's where you have like infinite replication of something, and basically infinite reach, infinite possible distribution. And that's where you have a ton of leverage.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the hard part always in all of this is there's no guarantees. You're not, just because you have leverage doesn't mean that will result in, ultimately the purpose of this concept is wealth creation. Wealth creation being defined as having enough resources at your disposal that you have the freedom to spend your time as you'd like. There's no guarantees. Just because you are creating a product, you're creating an album, you're writing a book, you're making a piece of furniture, you're writing a cookbook, whatever, that does not guarantee you the outcome, but it gives you a chance. It gives you a chance to get to wealth because it does not cost you anything the 150,000th time someone buys your book, right? It costed you nothing compared to the first one. The first one was really expensive because you had to get it out there to get the first sale, and it has to be good enough. The first person will take a risk based on your reputation, though. The 100,000th person will know by then whether it's any good. And so you have to both look at, and this gets to that quote on taste and ability
from Ira Glass.
from Ira Glass, right? And it's so good. But essentially that as you get more skilled and you have specific knowledge or skills, which Naval also talks about, you can make higher and higher quality stuff. And that makes your stuff more likely to spread. It doesn't guarantee it still, but the higher quality and the bigger the impact that you have on a person through the creative output that you're putting out into the world, the more likely they are to share it with another person and another person and another person. And so you're not just going on your reputation. Well, actually, I guess that's an extension of your reputation.
Right.
You're now known for making quality work, and therefore it's more likely to spread. And so you have more leverage along the way. And so you can see how these kind of layers build. You've got reputation, you've got creating assets, you've got assets that people can buy infinitely. And then if you apply over time, what we've chosen to do at this company is we also apply the leverage of labor and capital. And we would never talk about our team in terms of
Yeah.
labor unless it were in the context of this
Like
podcast
economic
episode.
theory.
Right. Um, but we've also chosen to lead in a way, you've chosen to lead in a way that everyone has skin in the game because they all have equity upside that will allow them to benefit both today from salary and long term. And so they've got leverage too in this company if it succeeds over a long period of time. And that's exactly what we want, is a small team of people who act like owners.
Yeah, so we've got a great crew of people here in the chat today. And I'd love if you have examples of how you've achieved leverage in your business, just sound them off in the chat and we'd love to share a few of those. But even just taking another simple example of a different type of creator, right? If you go with a musician, this musician might start by playing individual gigs. So for example, I was at a New Year's party this last year where some friends had hired 4 students from Boise State who had a jazz quartet to play for the New Year's party, and it made it super fun, right? But there's not really any leverage there because they had to show up at a specific time in a specific place. But then as they go and they release that first album or they get some of those singles out, now people can be listening to their music and could be playing it at another party where they couldn't afford to spend the money to have these people come in. And so all of a sudden you go from the equivalent of the designer doing hourly work to the designer selling a product. And then for that band, as they add this extra element into it, if they add distribution as leverage, then they can build an audience of people wanting to follow them specifically. And that moves it from the category of, I just need some jazz music, what's on Spotify, to, let me tell you about these guys. They were really fantastic. I followed them because of this reason. And that starts to become a differentiator along the lines of reputation.
Yeah, I love that. So I know a couple of people in the chat that I can highlight how they've gained leverage, and then Becky shared a great example as well. So Dave Stewart's here live today, and Dave's a teacher in Michigan, and so one way, like he is labor in the context of the education environment, right? But what Dave has done is he's created a whole bunch of leverage for himself. First, he taught other teachers how to use the methods that have worked really well for him through workshops and going to different school districts. And he still does some of that. But over time, he's done more and more productization of that work by creating online products and trainings and resources. He's written a book now that's done very well. And so he went from just being labor in the context of education, which he loves. And so now he's choosing to continue doing that work, even though he could leave it and just focus on the leveraged work that he has. But the reason he gets to make that choice instead of feeling stuck as a teacher is that he's gone out and he's created products that allow him to have zero marginal cost of selling more of them over time. And so the more his business shifts from needing to show up in a place to these products, the more freedom he gets to choose how to spend his time, which a lot of us end up doing by nature, focusing on impact. How can I have the most impact, even if it's on a small group of people, with my time? Another example here today is Brad from the Pen Addict. So this is a perfect example of specialized knowledge in the online world. Brad just talks about pens, writing utensils. And he's got a rabid following of people who care deeply about pens as well. And there's not a lot of space for 1 million people to just talk about pens, but there's enough space for someone to be very good at this. And so what Brad's done is he has made pens, but instead of just making pens, he talks about people who make pens. And that gives him a ton more leverage, actually. And so then if he wants to go do a fun project where he makes a pen and sells it, great. But he doesn't have to rely on labor in order to make his living, because he's talking about everyone else who's using capital and labor as their levers, and he gets to laugh all the way to the bank. And he's not the kind of person who would laugh all the way to the bank. It's a turn of phrase, but about the leverage he's got from media, because he can get a much wider audience from the way he's tackling the problem.
Yeah. Oh, those are great examples. And it's just fun to pull from the community because there's so many different things. And there's a lot of ways that you can find leverage in what you're doing. And Becky dropped a great one in the chat talking about how she brought on full-time childcare in order to have leverage with her time to be able to get high impact time to focus on her business. Because she realized that, okay, there could be a lot of leverage there. And actually, if you take this as an example, if you're thinking about time spent taking care of your kids, um, and you're wanting to hire someone else to do that for a portion of the day, then you're going to need to go do an activity that earns more than what you're paying, right? So you have to have outsized results. And so you get into that situation where you realize, like, okay, I now have a business. I now have a creative endeavor that can earn more than what I'm paying in childcare. Or this goes to, any other household activity, cleaning the house or whatever. Um, and then you can start to get leverage. And then, especially as this leverage compounds, because what you're going to find, and this is the same through the flywheel episode that we we're talking about, and everything, is that it takes a lot of work to get going and get these things started. But it's not like you magically get a certain amount of leverage and then it stays at that. It's that as you do these activities, you're like, okay, I got a little bit of leverage. That works. And then the audience grows, the reputation grows, the product gets better. And you realize that over time, you're getting a tiny bit more leverage every single day.
Yeah, I love that. We could go on and on. I have so many thoughts related to this, which is typical, but I'm going to be disciplined and say, creator of the day.
I love that that's what it looks like to be disciplined in Barrett Brooks' life. I'm going to be disciplined and cut to a jingle. All right. So today's creator of the day for me is someone who's actually taught me a lot about leverage, and probably taught me about leverage before I knew to call it leverage. I knew to define the term. And that's Chris Guillebeau. So Chris wrote a blog years ago called The Art of Nonconformity. He still writes the blog, but I came across it in 2011, 2010, maybe. I distinctly remember reading a guest post on Tim Ferriss's site from Chris, and he talked about, actually don't even remember what the guest post was about, but I loved the post and I dove into his site. I think I read all of like Chris's entire website over the weekend. And one thing that I found was that he was coming on book tour for his first book, The Art of Nonconformity, to Boise the following Tuesday. And so I went from never having heard of him to have read pretty much everything he had written to meeting him in person in like 5 days. And he set me on a trajectory to earn a living from my writing, build an audience, and start to get this leverage. So I'm going to, since my resource is also a Chris Guillebeau thing, I'm going to dive right in. He has a new book that came out today called The Money Tree. And I'll drop a link to that. But if you go to aonc.co/moneytree, check that out. I actually haven't read the book yet because it just came out, but I've read everything else that Chris has written, and it's very much worth your time.
Yeah, Chris's The Art of Nonconformity had a major impact on me early on as well. So I think he can take a lot of credit for a lot of people who were very inspired by his work early on. He was very much ahead of the curve. Conveniently, my creator and resource of the day are also tied together. My creator of the day is I don't know if they're still a duo, but when I knew them, they were a duo, husband and wife, Jamie being the core of this Etsy shop, but they would host, her and her husband would host in-home dinner parties where they would cook. He's a trained chef and she's an artist. And I found them one time at a little market, just like a Saturday market in Atlanta. I'm from Atlanta, by the way, if you wonder, like, wait, you were in Portland, but Atlanta is where home was. That's what shaped me. Portland is where I chose to live because I like it. Anyways, the Etsy shop is awesome. So they, Homespun ATL, they host dinner party, or they used to host dinner parties that they would cook for you and have all your friends over. And they've got this delightful Etsy shop centered around Georgia and food, stationery, and things like that. My resource of the day is, I'll scroll down and show you this printable set of all 4 seasons. And then I'm going to show you my version of it. It's quite cheap, actually. This is just a PDF version, but I bought an in-person version long ago. And so every season we switch out our little prints. This is clearly the old version because they look different than the ones I just showed you. But it shows you all the stuff that's in season. You know, a lot of nutritionists say eat by the season if you want to kind of vary your diet and be healthier. And I love them. I was changing it over today and I thought, this is a really cool way to highlight a creator. And we truly do buy more produce that's in season because of these things. So anyways, that's my
pretty awesome
resource of the day. Yeah.
Well, good. A couple things as we wrap up. First, go subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. Someone was mentioning in the chat, it'd be nice to listen to the past episodes, and you can, because that's how podcasts work. So definitely go subscribe. We'll drop all of the links in the chat so you can do that. And we'll actually get the futurebelongs-to-creators.com up and running so that you can link to there.
So for a closing thought of the day, I'd love you to maybe spend some time journaling this afternoon and think about, where do I currently have leverage in my business? Where could I create more leverage in my business using media or products? Really focusing on things that I could do that would create zero marginal cost assets that can make money for me, whether I put more effort in or not. And then maybe something that we'll touch a little bit more on the emotional side is, where are you shying away or leaning out from signing your name to your work? Where could you be taking accountability by staking your reputation as an individual on the work that you're putting out? And what are maybe the reasons that you're shying away from it? What's holding you back there? Because I think that might unlock some really interesting upside potential long term.
That's great. All right. See you all tomorrow. Thanks for listening.